The rain battered the windshield as Lisa gripped the steering wheel, squinting through the downpour. The highway was barely visible, a dark ribbon stretching ahead into nothingness. The old Chevy rumbled as it fought against the wind, the tires splashing through the endless puddles forming on the asphalt. "We should have taken the earlier exit," Mary muttered from the passenger seat, arms crossed. She was visibly tense, her fingers tapping against her knee. "This storm is insane." "We didn't know it would get this bad," Liza replied, keeping her focus ahead. In the back seat, Stephen and George sat in silence, their eyes glued to their phones. Though there was no signal this far out, they had left town late, hoping to reach the cabin before midnight, but nature had other plans. The storm had rolled in quickly, turning the highway into a treacherous path of darkness and uncertainty. Then, as if on cue, the engine sputtered. The Chevy coughed and shuddered before the dashboard lights flickered and died. "Shit," Liza cursed, steering the car to the side of the road as it coasted to a stop. "You've got to be kidding me," George groaned, rubbing his face. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Stephen tried his phone again. No service. Lisa exhaled sharply and rested her head against the steering wheel. This was the last thing they needed. The rain continued to pound against the roof of the car, drowning out the silence inside. "There was a diner a few miles back," Mary said suddenly. "I saw the sign." Stephen perked up. "Yeah, I think I saw it too. Looked old, but it had lights on." Lisa hesitated. "A diner? This late? Don't you have a better idea?" Mary shot back. Liza sighed. She didn't. "Fine, we walk." The Bellwood Diner stood alone on the roadside, its neon sign flickering erratically, casting a sickly red glow onto the wet pavement. The letters buzzed loudly, some barely clinging to life. BLOD Dining. The building itself was old, its windows streaked with rain, its walls bearing the weight of time. Yet, despite its worn appearance, there was something unsettling about it, something unnatural. "Looks welcoming," George muttered sarcastically. Liza pushed open the door, and a small bell jingled above their heads. The interior was dimly lit, with dull yellow lights reflecting off the cracked linoleum floor. The air smelled of stale coffee and something else, something faintly metallic. At first glance, the diner appeared empty. The booths lined the walls, their red leather seats cracked and torn in places. The counter stretched along the side, complete with rusted bar stools. Then they saw her. Behind the counter stood an older woman, her uniform faded, her name tag barely legible. Her face was long and expressionless, deep wrinkles carved into her skin. She stared at them, unblinking as they entered. "You? Hi," Liza greeted hesitantly. The woman's gaze lingered before she finally spoke. "Sit anywhere." Her voice was raspy, like she hadn't spoken in years. Mary tugged at Lisa's sleeve. "This place is weird." "No arguments there," George muttered. They made their way to a booth near the window, shaking the rain from their jackets. The seats were cold, unnaturally cold. Liza shivered as she slid in beside Stephen, while Mary and George took the other side. The old woman shuffled over, not bothering to take out a notepad. "Coffee?" They all nodded. She disappeared behind the counter. "I swear, this place feels like something out of a horror movie," Mary whispered, glancing around. "You were just paranoid," Stephen said, though he didn't look convinced. Then the waitress returned, setting 4 cups of coffee in front of them. She hesitated, staring at them again at the booth they were sitting in. "You shouldn't sit there," she murmured. Liza frowned. "What?" The woman's lips pressed together. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she repeated that booth is taken. A chill crawled up Lisa's spine. She exchanged glances with the others. We don't see anyone else," George said carefully. The woman didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the back of the diner. Silence. The 4 sat still, their hands hovering over their coffee cups. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on them like an unseen force. Then the jukebox in the corner crackled to life. A distorted tune, old and warbled, filled the diner. Mary flinched. That thing wasn't working when we came in. They'd all turned toward it. The jukebox screen flickered, displaying a song title, "Don't Sit There." Liza's breath hitched. What the actual, George started, but his voice was cut off as the booth beneath them trembled. The coffee cups rattled. The lights flickered violently. Then, a whisper. You took my seat. It was right beside them. The air turned ice cold. The whisper grew louder, multiplying, surrounding them. Then came the worst part. A handprint, large and skeletal, formed on the condensation of the window beside them. Mary screamed, scrambling out of the booth. Liza followed, nearly tripping as they all rushed toward the exit. But the door wouldn't budge. The old woman was nowhere in sight. The jukebox music warped, playing backward, the voices within it whispering unintelligible things. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from behind them. Liza turned, and she saw him. A man stood by the booth they had been sitting in. No, not a man. His face was hollow, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. His eyes were black pits, and his mouth curled into a grotesque grin. His clothes were tattered, soaked in something dark. You took my seat, he whispered again. Then the booth behind him groaned as if it were breathing. Suddenly, Mary was yanked backward. Invisible hands gripped her, dragging her toward the booth. She clawed at the floor, her nails scraping against the tile. The ICA, she screamed. Liza lunged for her, grabbing her arm. Stephen and George did the same, pulling with all their strength. But the force was stronger. Mary was being pulled into the booth, into the seat, into the darkness that now swirled around it. And then the lights burst. The room plunged into total darkness. For a moment, nothing but silence. Then, a single voice. You can't leave. Light returned. The diner was empty. The old woman was gone. The jukebox was silent. And so was the booth. Mary was gone. Liza, George gasped, stumbling backward. She's. The seat where Mary had been was untouched. No sign of struggle. No trace of her existence. Stephen turned to Liza, his face pale. What the hell just happened? Liza couldn't breathe. Then her eyes caught something on the table. A single, damp napkin. Scrawled in smeared ink were the words, I'm still here. The door to the diner creaked open on its own. The night outside was still, the storm having vanished, and in the window's reflection, Mary sat in the booth, watching, waiting. Lisa's hands trembled as she stared at the napkin, her breath shallow. The ink was smudged, but the words were still clear. I'm still here. Mary was gone, but not really. A cold realization crept into Lisa's bones. She turned toward the booth, her eyes darting to the window's reflection. And there she was. Mary sat exactly where she had been, but she wasn't the same. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak. Her eyes, wide, empty, void of light, stared straight at them. A slow, unnatural smile curled on her face. Liza spun around, expecting to see Mary sitting in the booth for real. But the seat was empty. Only the reflection held her presence. No, this isn't real, Stephen whispered, his voice shaking. We need to get out of here, George stammered. Liza took a cautious step back, her mind racing. Mary, she whispered. In the reflection, Mary's head tilted, her mouth moving, but no sound came out. Her fingers slowly lifted, pressing against the window from the other side of the glass. Then a new message formed on the fogged-up window, written by an unseen hand. Don't leave me. Liza's heart pounded. She reached for the door handle, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. We have to go, she choked out. George yanked on the door. It groaned but didn't budge. The air in the diner grew thick, suffocating. The lights flickered wildly. The jukebox let out a garbled static noise, as if trying to form words. And then, the whisper came again. Sit with me. The voice was Mary's. Liz's entire body tensed. In the window's reflection, Mary's face had changed. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness. Her smile stretched unnaturally wide. Her fingers drummed against the glass, slow and deliberate. Then she stood up. Not in real life, only in the reflection. Liza's breath hitched as Mary's ghostly figure turned, stepping out of the booth in the mirrored world, approaching them from inside the glass. Closer. Closer. Her hands pressed harder against the window, the glass starting to crack beneath her fingers. Let me out. Her voice rasped through the diner. Then the glass shattered. A cold gust of air rushed through the room as the diner's walls seemed to bend, the fluorescent lights above bursting one by one. The boots trembled, the floor groaning beneath their feet. A sharp, invisible force yanked Lisa back toward the booth. No, no, she screamed, thrashing. Stephen and George grabbed her arms, pulling her away just in time. The booth, now pulsating like a living thing, let out a guttural, inhuman noise, and then the door burst open on its own. The storm was gone. The night was eerily silent. Without hesitation, the three of them bolted outside, sprinting toward the car. Liza fumbled for the keys with shaking hands. She didn't know how or why, but the Chevy roared to life as soon as she turned the ignition. They peeled away from the diner, speeding down the empty highway, the neon sign of Bellwood Diner shrinking in the distance. No one spoke. No one dared look back. Hours later, they reached the city. None of them had spoken a word since they had left. They pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzing harshly overhead. George exhaled shakily, rubbing his face. What the hell just happened? Lisa's hands were still gripping the steering wheel. Stephen swallowed hard. Mary, she's... He couldn't finish. Liza's gaze slowly lifted to the rearview mirror, and her blood ran cold. In the reflection, the back seat was no longer empty. Mary was sitting there, smiling. Her whisper slithered into Lisa's ear, chilling her to the core. You didn't save me.